A letter written 33 centuries ago sits in the British Museum, and it describes something that shouldn't exist. Not in the careful language of mythology, not in the exaggerated poetry of legend, in the dry, bureaucratic tone of a military report. Egyptian scribe Hori, writing to his colleague Amenemope around 1250 BCE, mentions warriors in the northern territories, Shosu fighters hiding in the narrow passes. Then he provides their measurements: 4 cubits, 5 cubits, head to foot. That's 6 feet 8 inches to 8 feet 4 inches tall, in an era when the average man stood 5'2". The papyrus isn't controversial because it mentions tall people. It's controversial because it treats their existence as routine. Hori doesn't present these figures as monsters or divine beings requiring explanation. He describes them the way you describe any tactical threat: their location, their temperament, their unwillingness to negotiate. The Shosu, concealed beneath the bushes, fierce of face, hearts not mild. Military intelligence, not mythology. And that's the problem scholars can't quite resolve. Because if this is just satirical correspondence, as many academics insist, why include specific height measurements? Satire doesn't usually concern itself with precise cubit counts. If Hori wanted to mock Amenemope's geographical ignorance, he could have invented absurd details, impossible landscapes, fantastical creatures. Instead, he provides the kind of observational data that appears throughout Egyptian military records of the period. Place names that match other documents, tactical descriptions that align with known Egyptian campaigns in Canaan, and measurements that, while extraordinary, fall within a range that makes everyone uncomfortable. Too specific to be fiction, too extraordinary to be ordinary. The Shosu themselves present another layer of complexity. Egyptian records reference them consistently throughout the New Kingdom period, always as semi-nomadic peoples living in the hill country of Canaan and Transjordan. Not mythical beings from distant lands, but identifiable groups occupying specific territories. They dominated regions with such effectiveness that they could temporarily sever Egypt's northern trade routes, prompting military responses from multiple pharaohs. These weren't background characters in ancient mythology. They were significant enough to be named enemies of the Egyptian state. And here's where the pattern becomes harder to dismiss. 2 separate Egyptian texts, one from the 14th century BCE and another from the 13th, reference something called the land of the Shasu Yahweh. The hieroglyphic rendering matches the Hebrew tetragrammaton with remarkable precision. 5 centuries before the oldest previously known occurrence of that divine name appeared on the Mesha Stele, which means either Egyptian scribes were documenting a people group connected to what would become Israelite religion, or we've fundamentally misunderstood the timeline of how that religious tradition developed. Either possibility disrupts established historical frameworks, but it's the physical descriptions that keep pulling scholars back to uncomfortable questions. Because Papyrus Anastasi, the first, isn't alone. Egyptian execration texts reference the Anak, people of great stature whose name directly parallels the biblical Anakim. Wall reliefs from the Battle of Kadesh, dated to around 1274 BCE, show captured Shasu prisoners depicted at noticeably larger scale than surrounding figures. A Canaanite tablet mentions Rapu, king of eternity, ruling in Ashtaroth and Edrei, the exact cities later associated with Og and the Rephaim in biblical accounts. One source could be dismissed, 2 might be coincidence, but when names, places, physical descriptions, and time periods align across multiple independent records from different cultures, the convergence demands explanation. The biblical text certainly took these figures seriously. Numbers 13:33 describes Israelite spies returning from Canaan. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Not metaphorical grasshoppers, not symbolic language about feeling intimidated. Grasshoppers. The kind of comparison you make when the scale difference is so dramatic that normal descriptive language fails. 1 Samuel describes Goliath at 6 cubits and a span, over 9 feet tall. The giant og's bed measured 13 feet long, preserved as a museum piece in ancient times. An Egyptian mercenary encountered by David's forces stood 7.5 feet tall. These accounts span different time periods, different authors, different political contexts. Yet they consistently describe populations of extraordinary height in the same geographical regions Egyptian records mention. The skeptical response is predictable. Where are the bones? Where's the physical evidence? If giants existed in significant numbers, surely archaeology would have uncovered skeletal remains, oversized dwellings, artifacts scaled to larger hands. It's a reasonable objection until you consider what actually survives in the archaeological record. We know entire civilizations primarily through pottery fragments and eroded inscriptions. We reconstruct complex societies from foundation stones and trash heaps. The absence of giant skeletons might mean they never existed, or it might mean that 3,000 years of environmental exposure, scavenging, and soil chemistry don't preserve human remains as reliably as we'd like to believe, especially when biblical accounts specifically describe these populations being systematically destroyed through warfare and divine judgment. But there's another category of evidence that's harder to explain away. Not what we've found, but what we're still finding. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls revealed something unexpected about how ancient communities understood these figures, and what they preserved might change everything we think we know about the boundary between history and mythology. In 1971, Yosef Milik was cataloguing Aramaic fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls when he noticed something unusual. Several pieces bore striking resemblance to an obscure text called the Book of Giants, a work that had survived only in later Manichaean translations. But these fragments were older, much older. Dating back to approximately 100 BCE, they represented something scholars hadn't expected to find: an entire literary tradition focused exclusively on the giants themselves, narrated from their perspective. The Book of Giants never made it into the biblical canon. It exists now only in fragments scattered across multiple Qumran caves, numbered according to where they were discovered. 1. Q23, 2. Q26, 4. Q203, and others. Incomplete pieces of a larger narrative that the Qumran community apparently treasured enough to preserve multiple copies. Scholar Joseph Angel notes it's the only known ancient text to focus entirely on these figures and their exploits, giving them voice rather than simply describing them as obstacles to be overcome. What survives paints an unexpected picture. The fragments describe the Nephilim becoming aware that their violent and deviant ways will lead to imminent destruction. They're scared, terrified enough to ask Enoch to intercede on their behalf before God. These aren't mindless monsters or mythological abstractions. They're beings conscious of their fate, desperate to avoid it, aware that judgment is coming and unable to stop it. The Qumran community that hid these scrolls in desert caves before Roman destruction clearly valued these stories. They worked with texts inherited from earlier Hebrew traditions, then expanded them, elaborated on them, preserved them with the same care they gave to biblical books. After the Hebrew scriptures had been completed, giants continued to proliferate in Jewish literature of the 3rd through 1st centuries BCE. Not as fading legends, but as active subjects of theological reflection. Early interpreters saw in these figures something meaningful beyond simple folklore. They represented the persistence of evil, the meaning of empire, the consequences of transgression, questions that mattered to communities living under occupation, watching empires rise and fall, trying to understand their place in a world dominated by forces beyond their control. But here's what makes the Dead Sea Scrolls discovery so significant for our investigation. It proves these weren't just stories parents told children. These were serious theological texts, copied and recopied, studied and debated by educated communities. The kind of literature you preserve when you believe it contains actual historical memory, not merely entertaining fiction. Why would a community dedicate resources to preserving elaborate narratives about giants if they understood them to be purely metaphorical? Why develop complex theological frameworks around their origins, actions, and ultimate fate if everyone knew they never existed? The skeptical counter is immediate. Ancient people believed lots of things that weren't true. They preserved myths about gods walking among mortals, heroes performing impossible feats, cosmic battles that never happened. The fact that they treated giant narratives seriously doesn't make giants real. Fair enough, except the giant accounts don't read like myths. Myths operate in sacred time. In the age when the world was young and different rules applied, they feature gods and demigods whose actions explain why thunder crashes or seasons change. But the biblical giant narratives are stubbornly historical. They name specific places you can visit: Ashtaroth, Edrei, Hebron. They provide measurements: 6 cubits and a span, 13 feet. They describe military engagements with tactical details, political contexts, genealogies connecting these figures to specific tribal groups. When Egyptian scribes mentioned the Shosu of unusual height, they weren't recording mythology. They were documenting military intelligence, warning about hostile forces in specific geographic locations. The tone is bureaucratic, practical, concerned with logistics and strategy. These are the kinds of details that survive in administrative records because someone needed to know them for operational purposes. Which brings us back to the convergence problem that keeps appearing. The Berlin Museum houses Egyptian incantations against the Anek, whom Egyptians regarded as being of great stature. The name matches the biblical Anakim with uncomfortable precision. Not similar, nearly identical. Different writing systems, different languages, same phonetic structure pointing to the same people group. Reliefs from Kadesh show Shasu prisoners towering over their captors. Canaanite tablets mention Rapu ruling in the exact cities later associated with Og and the Rephaim. Egyptian texts reference Shosu Yahweh in the same regions and time periods where biblical accounts place these populations. One source might preserve garbled memories of tall individuals. Two could share common mythological roots. But when multiple independent records from different cultures across several centuries keep pointing to the same phenomenon in the same locations, the coincidence explanation starts requiring more faith than the alternative. Archaeologist G.E. Wright suggested that Hebrew beliefs about giants originated from encountering massive Transjordanian structures and Canaanite cities with walls 18 feet thick. When ancient people saw cyclopean masonry they couldn't explain, they invented giants to account for it. It's a tidy explanation that conveniently ignores why those same ancient people also had detailed Egyptian records describing unusually tall populations in identical locations. Unless the architectural evidence and the textual evidence aren't separate phenomena requiring separate explanations. Unless the massive structures and the giant accounts are describing the same reality from different angles. Unless someone actually built those walls, and the people who built them were exactly who the records say they were. The question isn't whether we have perfect proof. We don't. The question is whether the evidence we do have points more consistently toward existence than non-existence. And that answer depends entirely on what you're willing to consider possible. What shifts the conversation entirely is when you stop treating these accounts as isolated curiosities and start treating them as fragments of a larger pattern. The Papyrus Anastasia. I wasn't discovered yesterday. It's been sitting in the British Museum since 1839, catalogued, studied, filed away. A 3,300-year-old Egyptian document containing a passage that should have sparked immediate discussion, but didn't. The scribe Hori, writing to mock his colleague Amenemope's incompetence, describes Shosu warriors in a narrow mountain pass, 4 to 5 cubits tall, 6 foot 8 to 8 foot 4. In an era when average human height hovered around 5'2", these measurements weren't poetic exaggeration. They were tactical intelligence, the kind of detail that matters when you're calculating how many soldiers you need, how much food to requisition, whether a standard formation will hold against an enemy whose physical advantages are measurable and documented. Critics dismiss it as satirical, an instructional letter designed to embarrass a fellow scribe through absurd scenarios. But satire doesn't work this way. You don't mock someone's military incompetence by inventing plausible threats in real geographic locations with specific measurements. Satire exaggerates to the point of absurdity. 8-foot-tall warriors concealed in mountain passes aren't absurd if your audience already knows such warriors exist. The passage only functions as mockery if a Menimope should have known about these populations and failed to account for them, which means the Shosu of unusual height weren't legendary. They were expected knowledge. The Shosu appear throughout New Kingdom Egyptian texts. Semi-nomadic groups moving through Lebanon, Syria, Canaan, Transjordan. The earliest reference dates to the 16th century BCE. By the time of Amenhotep III and Rameses II, Egyptian records reference the land of Shosu Yahweh, a geographic designation that predates the oldest biblical occurrence of the divine name by 5 centuries. These weren't mythological peoples dwelling in sacred time. They were contemporary military concerns, populations powerful enough to cut Egyptian supply routes, requiring organized campaigns to suppress. Now consider what happens when you layer the Anastasi papyrus over biblical accounts. Numbers 13 describes Israelite spies returning from Canaan, reporting inhabitants so large they felt like grasshoppers in comparison. The Anakim, descendants of Anak. Not vague legendary figures, but named tribal groups occupying specific territories. Hebron, specifically, a city you can visit. Egyptian execration texts, independent documents from a different culture, reference the Ie Anak. Same phonetic structure, same geographic region, same implication of unusual stature. Reliefs from the Battle of Kadesh show captured Shasu prisoners towering over their Egyptian captors. The artistic convention could be dismissed as symbolic if we didn't have the written records describing exactly what the artwork depicts. Canaanite tablets mention Rapu ruling in Ashtaroth and Edrei, the precise cities later associated with Og, and the Rephaim in biblical accounts. Different sources, different time periods, different languages, identical geographic and cultural markers. The Dead Sea Scrolls add another dimension entirely. The Book of Giants, fragments dating to 100 BCE, focuses exclusively on these figures from their own perspective. Not as distant myths, but as entities whose actions and fate warranted detailed theological consideration. The Qumran community preserved these texts alongside canonical scripture, suggesting the line between accepted history and excluded tradition wasn't as clear as later orthodoxy implied. Scholar Joseph Angel notes this is the only known ancient text narrated from the giants' viewpoint, depicting them becoming aware of their impending destruction and desperately seeking intercession. Why would multiple generations invest this level of literary and theological effort into fictional beings? The usual answer involves cultural anxieties, mythological frameworks borrowed from neighbouring civilizations, symbolic representations of human hubris or foreign threat. But that explanation requires believing that Egyptians independently developed similar accounts about similar populations in similar locations for similar practical purposes, that biblical authors coincidentally placed their giant narratives in the exact territories where Egyptian records document unusually tall warriors, and that architectural evidence of massive construction just happens to cluster in these same regions. You're allowed to believe that's all coincidence. You're allowed to conclude that absence of skeletal evidence outweighs convergent textual, artistic, and architectural patterns. But you should at least acknowledge what you're dismissing, not a single questionable source. Not one culture's mythology, a network of independent records spanning centuries and civilizations, describing the same phenomenon in the same places using the same geographic markers and tactical details. The scholarly response has been remarkably consistent. Acknowledge the texts exist, categorize them as historical curiosities or administrative records, then move to other topics without exploring the implications. The British Museum describes Anastasi I as illustrating military life and geographic awareness. Accurate, but incomplete. It illustrates those things by documenting populations whose existence challenges foundational assumptions about ancient demographics. The silence isn't suppression. It's something more subtle. It's the quiet agreement that certain questions lead nowhere productive, that some evidence is better left unexamined because examining it requires reconsidering frameworks that took centuries to establish. But the evidence doesn't disappear just because we stop looking at it. The papyrus remains in London. The reliefs still show what they show. The cities named in multiple sources by multiple cultures still stand where the records said they'd be. Somewhere between absolute proof and comfortable dismissal lies the uncomfortable middle ground where most historical truth actually resides. The place where you admit what the sources actually say, acknowledge the patterns they form, and recognize that our explanations might be protecting conclusions we reached before we examined all the evidence. Maybe the real question isn't whether giants existed, maybe it's why we're so determined to prove they didn't. Because if Egyptian scribes documented warriors 8 feet tall, if multiple cultures recorded the same populations in the same locations, if architectural evidence supports exactly what the texts describe, then something fundamental shifts. Not just about ancient history, about what we've chosen to remember and what we've chosen to forget. The papyrus Anastasi I sits in the British Museum right now. You could go see it. Read Hori's measurements yourself. 4 cubits, 5 cubits. Written 33 centuries ago in the dry language of military logistics. Not legend, not mythology, intelligence. And the question it poses isn't complicated. It's just uncomfortable. What if the sources are telling the truth? What if the convergence isn't coincidence? What if the giants in the ancient records were exactly what every culture that encountered them said they were? Not symbols, not metaphors, not mistakes in translation or measurement. People, just extraordinarily tall people who lived in specific places during specific periods and left behind exactly the kind of evidence you'd expect if they'd actually existed. Buildings too large, records too consistent, patterns too precise to dismiss. You don't have to believe it, but you should at least be willing to ask why believing it feels so impossible when the evidence keeps insisting otherwise.